I said, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to take all these verses that you just gave me where they have the negative inference fallacy, and I want you to apply that hermeneutic consistently to Galatians 2:20. Because in Galatians 2:20, it says, the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, if I take the Calvinist hermeneutic of, say, Acts 20:28, where he says, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. Well, that must mean that he did not purchase anybody else with his blood, even though 2 Peter chapter 2 would say otherwise, because he purchased who bought them. False teachers who are hellbound were bought by Christ, who bought them. So they commit the negative inference fallacy. If we apply a consistent hermeneutic to Galatians 2:20, what do we get? And basically, even ChatGPT recognizes you might actually have a situation where Christ's atonement only applies to Paul. So you want to look at the hermeneutic that's being used and see if you can consistently apply. Like, what did I do to get to this conclusion? And if I do the same thing in other verses, does it make sense? And if it doesn't, if you don't think Christ only died for Paul, then it's probably a bad idea to use the negative inference fallacy on the other passages as well, okay? It's if you can't use a hermeneutic consistently, okay, then it's not a good hermeneutic. I like the way even ChatGPT can figure this out. You can't gaslight ChatGPT, okay? I mean, I'm sure somebody could in a conversation. You could train it in a conversation to be gaslit. But this should clearly demonstrate that the problems we keep pointing out with the inconsistencies with Calvinism and the methods they claim to follow, they're not following any methods. Calvinism prescribes what you must believe when you believe in Calvinism. All the beliefs are then, they cascade, starting with total depravity. We went over this in last night's stream. And then once you have the cascaded beliefs, you have to find a way to worm them back into the Bible. That's how Calvinism is built. There are no passages that say Calvinistic doctrine. There's not one anywhere that say distinctively Calvinistic doctrine. The reason I have to put distinctively in there is because Calvinists do claim to believe a lot of the things that other Christians believe. Like, we believe that Christ rose from the dead. Well, they will say that, but that's not a distinctive Calvinistic belief. That's a belief shared by Christians and Bible believers as well, not just Calvinists, okay? Did you catch that Russell conjugation right there? So pay attention. I might slip them in on you. I know when I'm doing it. I know when I'm manipulating people. Now, you'll have Calvinists say these kinds of things. He did not die. Christ did not die to make men savable, but to save them. Now, I heard this repeated by James White, and I hear it repeated all the time. And I see this same phrase in memes attributed to other people, because people like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul and John Piper, all the clowns, they're all repeating this kind of thing. And it sounds sanctimonious. And so this is a sanctimoniously framed sentence that means absolutely nothing. The sentence structure sounds moralistic and sanctimonious when some bloviating, egotistical big head states it from a pulpit. One can literally put any other word in the sentence and make that concept sound sanctimonious, or make it oblivious how silly the original sentence is. You could say, he did not die to make men ticklish, but to tickle. He did not die to make men laughable, but to laugh. He did not die to make men readable, but to read them. Or to make men boopable, but to boop them. You can literally put anything there. And you know what the commonality is with any of those sentences? These sentences are just as biblical as the one spoken by Charles Spurgeon. You know why? Because Christ's death doesn't save anybody. There is no, now it sounds horrible to say that. Now, don't get me wrong. You can't be saved without Christ's death. But it is just one component of salvation, and many other components of salvation are also needed, such as faith and glorification. I'll show you a chart in just a second where you can look at those. This is just as unscriptural. Now, it's what they do, since there is no passage in the Bible, they can't, if they wanted to prove to you limited atonement, they could just open up the Bible and show you the verse that talks about limited atonement. The problem is that verse is not there. So what are they going to do next? They're going to wrap it in moralistic, sanctimonious language. He did not die to make men savable. He died to save men. It's just as unscriptural. Just because someone bloviates it sanctimoniously like that doesn't make it any more true. But we have vulnerabilities in our data processor, and even though nobody proved it to us in an epistemically sound way, we tend to go along with it anyway because somebody that we see as a spiritual authority figure bloviated it in a sanctimonious way. And so we go along with it. That is the reason people become Calvinists, because you have a bunch of clowns like this saying things like this and with sanctimonious, moralistic, bloviating framing. And it's said in such a way that if you disagree with them, it's like you've committed some kind of unpardonable sin. It's just this terrible, horrible thing, the unpardonable sin. So don't fall, that's what we call on this channel non-epistemic ranking criteria. And you do not want to fall for the NERC, okay? NERC, non-epistemic ranking criteria. It's the way they frame things it can frame things moralistically and insinuate that you are basically immoral. And like Prudence Mifruel said down here, the quote does sound good. Yeah, it sounds good. It's just not scriptural. So they frame things moral to make it sound immoral if you don't agree, and then they have a sanctimonious tone from the position of authority in the pulpit, which is an abuse of scriptural power. And yes, it is. Cricketson said it is Calvinism. Calvinianism. Calvinism. That's exactly what it is. It's too easy to fall for the NERC. So every time you see this, I want you to think of one of these other sentences. When somebody says, he did not die to make men savable, but to save them, is exactly the same as saying he did not die to make men boopable, but to boop them. It is just as scriptural to say that, okay? Because Christ dying didn't save anybody. Christ dying was necessary to save, but it's not what saved anybody. And we're going to look at the scope of the atonement, how the scope of the atonement is not just salvation. That's just a small part of the scope of the atonement. The scope of the atonement is cosmic. It is cosmic in scope, literally, okay?